Thank you. When we talk of Israeli resilience, we think of the extraordinary Israelis like Andre. So please join me in giving him a round of applause again. Those like Andre who have lived through the torment of captivity now face a long road ahead. Our next guest is tasked with guiding the former hostages on their journey to recovery. He was an Israeli Air Force pilot and former chief psychologist for the Mossad. He trained members of Israel's special forces on how to prepare for and survive the possibility of capture. His mission today, helping Israelis tap into their resilience. Please welcome Hostage Debrief Team Leader, Glenn Cohen. Glenn.
Hey, Dan.
Good. Thank you for being here.
It's an honor and a pleasure to be here.
I should say, let me just start by saying, you literally just got here. Given what you have been doing, you've been called up to be dealing with preparing for the hostages when they're released, debriefing them when they're released. So you've had a pretty tough week. And before we get into our conversation, I just, on behalf of everyone here, want to thank you for your service. You are doing extraordinary work. Among the things you've been doing, after October 7th, you were called up to help prepare the medical teams and the psychological teams to, account for what the hostages might be going through and then receive them when they return. Can you, and by the way, it's not just when they're released, also when they're rescued. So for instance, you were one of the, if not the first person inside Israel to see Andre and the other 3 hostages that were rescued on June 8th. Talk about that. Can you just tell us what happened in those first encounters?
Well, I think that's a classic story of the roller coaster that we're all in. And that was a roller coaster moment because I'm sitting at home, Shabbat morning, June 8th, eating shakshuka, and get a phone call, immediately have to go to the hospital to meet 4 hostages who've been released. And as I get to the hospital, I walk down the corridor, and then I see the Yamam warriors, that's the special unit who rescued them. I've been working with them for 10 years. I'm their resilience coach. And I see them there in the corridor, and they're all crying, and these guys don't normally cry. And then I realize that their commander, Arnon, the doctors had been trying to save his life, and they didn't succeed, and they just were informed that he died in this rescue operation. And there I am, hugging them and crying with them, and then I have to continue down the end of the corridor to meet Andre and Shlomi and Almog and Noah, and the doors open, and everyone is rejoicing and so happy, crying out of joy that they're there. And then meeting Andre and hearing everything he went through, and the incredible resilience that he and his friends showed there. And this is before his parents even came from abroad. And then to see Andre, as was described earlier, waiting for his mother, and he dropped to his knees as she came. That was the moment where I also cried, because I had to be in operational mode most of the time. But there are those moments like that where I also melted. And that's the roller coaster that we're all on.
So Glenn, speaking of you being in operational mode, when you do debrief these hostages, in many cases you're the first person having long conversations with them after their release or after their rescue. Tell us, I mean, we don't have a ton of time, but if you could focus us on one thing, what do you think is most important for us to know about what you learned from those conversations?
Well, out of the 147 stories that I met, I think the main thing is that we all have this concept, we imagine, a lot of people imagine that better be dead than be in captivity. And what I learned from these 147 is that captivity is hell, for sure. But they went to hell and came back to tell the tale, and they showed incredible resilience. I met people who came back and discovered that their entire family was murdered. And it's devastating, but they said things like, I'm not going to break, I'm going to rebuild my life, I can do this. And I think one of the main things that helped all of them was a sense of togetherness. That's something that I sense across the board. People who are held together, like the three, Shlomi, Andre, and Almog, or other people, just to feel like you're not alone, that gave them hope. What's amazing, though, is even somebody who was held alone, people who were held alone, found the way not to feel alone, because they would either have conversations with their loved ones, or they would see the news, and they'd see people at the hostage square. They would feel that people are caring for them, and they're not alone. There was one person who heard a psychotherapist talk on the radio about how to cope with captivity, and she actually took tips, and she learned from that. And so we have to realize also that they feel us, they hear us. So all of us together have to still be out there, support them, and they feel it, because they're not alone, because we're all in this together.
You and I spoke for my podcast after the first hostage deal, so after November of 2023, and you described what it was like receiving and working with hostages from that first hostage deal. It seems to me that was what, they were in captivity for about 50 days, right? Versus now, the hostages that are coming back now, 15, 16 plus months. What are the differences that you have found between hostages coming back from those different periods?
Yeah, well, it's actually fascinating to see, because a lot of it is actually counterintuitive. We thought that initially that the longer you're in captivity, the more difficult it would be. And there is an aspect to that. We saw a lot more anger. People who were left for so long behind, they came back feeling, how could we have been left behind for so long? And there was a lot of anger, rightfully so. But there was also belief. People strengthened their belief. We saw it after a year and 4 months. Many of the hostages actually became more religious and observant in captivity.
So talk about that for a minute, because I've heard a lot of those stories in this most recent round. And these are people who, many of whom were secular. They were from the kibbutzim in the south, and they tapped into some spiritual...
Completely. Yeah, no atheists in the trenches. And they completely tapped into that belief. There were people who were fasting on Yom Kippur. Imagine what that means in captivity, to fast on Yom Kippur. People wouldn't eat chametz on Pesach.
Or marshaling the little bit of bread they had to have challah for Shabbat.
Yeah, and to make kiddush, and praying. And there are many people who, it's the phenomenon that I saw very clearly. That belief was something that was very clear with time. The longer you're there, instead of tapping into despair, you cling on to the hope. And another amazing thing that we saw is that actually you would think that things would get worse over time, but for many of them, again, captivity is hell. Every day was hell. But for a lot of them, the biggest trauma of the entire 500 days was October 7th. What happened there, what they saw, what they experienced. And actually in captivity, a lot of them managed to actually adjust. The first stage is the initial shock and the trauma, but after a certain period of time, they actually adjusted, and they managed to not just to survive, but to really cope well. And instead of it being a traumatic experience, of course, it's always going to be a traumatic experience, but instead of it being labeled as just PTSD, there was a lot of PTG, post-traumatic growth, in captivity, which is mind-boggling. It means that even in that condition, you are able to not just adjust, but to grow.
Some of these hostages, we understand, were kept alone for the near entirety of their time. And everything you're describing even applies to those who've just been completely isolated for, 500 plus days?
Yes, even for the people held alone, they found the way to cope with being alone. And like I said, they wouldn't feel alone because they'd either connect with their loved ones in conversations, and they weren't being alone because they were held by captors. And even though these captors were monsters, they managed to find a way to even connect to them and not feel alone, and to manage to find the connection, to influence them, and to have an impact. And it's a survival mechanism. It's an unbelievable coping mechanism that we all have in us. And all the people out there that came back, they proved that we're all capable of much more than we imagine because we have this DNA. We're survivors from the Holocaust. So can I ask in the audience, how many people here are second, third generation from Holocaust survivors? You're living proof. We can do this. It's in our DNA, and that's the point. Even though it's the most difficult thing, there's a lot of growth from this trauma.
The impact of their return, the return of the hostages so far, and the stories they have told or will tell about their experiences, what does that tell you, or what is the impact on Israel's resilience, Israel, the national psyche of the Israeli people?
Yeah, I think now, especially this past week, we all realize why Israel has this crazy thing about Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaTzmaut, one after the other. The Remembrance Day, and after that, Independence Day. The hardest day of the year, and afterwards, the most joyous day of the year. And that's exactly what we're feeling now. That's the same roller coaster. We realize that the Israeli psyche it's all about both. We've had this traumatic event, October 7th, we're dealing with it, but at the same time, there's so much growth. And that's the Israeli psyche. I think that's what we're going to take away from this, that there's all this pain and suffering and the trauma, but we can grow from this. And that's what it's all about. This past week, we saw it, the Bibas family, and then right after that, another 6 people came out. That was within 48 hours, there was that roller coaster. Every day of Israeli existence is that, both. We have the pain and the suffering and the war and the loss, but we are going to grow from this because this is what we're made out of. We've got that stuff.
Just in wrapping up, and I know this is like a rifle shot in and out of the U.S. You're going back to Israel, and then you go back to wait. Can you describe what that's like just for you before we just wrap? I guess you go back to Israel and you wait for the next round of hostages. What's that like for you?
For me, it's a personal roller coaster. I'm still wearing the hospital bracelet to access into the hospital to meet the hostages. I decided I'm going to keep it until the next phase, and I'm sure we're going to meet the next. There are still dozens of hostages that are alive, waiting to meet them. And I'm not going to give up hope, and everybody here has to continue sending that energy and continue to pressure, and the American government is helping a lot, and all of us together, we're going to help and bring back the rest of the hostages.
Glenn Cohen, thank you.
Good job. Good job.